Okay, fantastic. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the University of Oxford Standardizing Criminology Discussion Group. Carla Sepulveda-Pena and I are now convening the group. We are delighted to have so many people joining us for our first session of this year. So today we are so pleased to host Professor David Nelken of the King's College London, who will talk on comparative criminal justice. Before we hand over to him, Carl and I would just like to say a few words about the group, about our events, and also some practicalities and so on. So first, we are a student-led group based at Oxford, but totally open to a wider public. So this means anyone can join our sessions, can participate in the discussions, and so on. Our broad aims are to foster discussions on criminological issues beyond core countries, but also to reflect on knowledge production, knowledge consumption in a wider way. So thinking of this, we prepared a program which is based on 3 main thematic modules. This first one, between October and early December, our sessions will deal with theoretical, methodological, and philosophical tools that may help us standardizing criminology, and that's the case of today's talk. The following term, between January and March, we invited some speakers who will talk about the research they've conducted in peripheral and also in semi-peripheral contexts. And finally, the last term, April to June, we'll get back to those discussions on criminology's state of art beyond the center. Our program is already available in our website, so please take a look at that if you want to know more about our following speakers, our following sessions, the dates, and so on. Okay, Carla and I also set up a new thing, which is a mailing list. So we'll be using this mostly to send out some reminders of our seminars. If you didn't know about it and want to join this, just let us know, and then we can add you to this mailing list. All right, I'll now hand over to Carla, who will give some information on the structure of the session, and then she will also introduce today's speaker, Professor David Nelken. Carla, over to you.
Thanks very much, Luis. Hi, everyone. My name is Carla Sepulveda, as you have heard. Thank you very much for being here. For those who haven't attended any of our previous events, our sessions last about 1 hour and a half. Professor Nelken will present on comparative criminal justice as a social practice, the case of standardizing indicators, which he will do for about 45 minutes. And then we will open the floor for discussion with the participants for another 45 minutes or so. The session today is all online, and maybe you have realized that we will be recording the first part of the talk. So I suppose you're all aware of how Teams works, but if not, just very briefly, I would ask you to please stay muted during Professor Nelken's talk, and if possible, to keep your cameras on. Then during the Q&A, you can use the Teams tool to raise your hand or use the chat box if you prefer. So now to the main thing. For those of you who don't know Professor Nelken, he has taught at the Cambridge, Edinburgh and University College London from 76 to 89 before he moved to Italy in 1990 as a distinguished professor of legal institutions and social change at the University of Macerata. From 95 to 2013, he was also a distinguished research professor of law at Cardiff University, and from 2010 to 2014, he was a visiting professor of criminology at Oxford University. He has received many awards, among them the American Sociological Association Distinguished Scholar Award, the Selin Gluck International Award for American Criminological Society, the Podgoricki Distinguished Senior Scholar Award from the International Sociological Association, and the US Law and Society Association's International Scholar Award. He's also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He was in the panel of the Scottish Children's Hearing Juvenile Justice System between 79 and 83, of the Italian regional committees in the 1990s, amongst many visiting appointments. He was a global law professor at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. So, Professor Nelken, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Very much. Thank you very much indeed, Carla and Louise, for inviting me. And greetings to all of you. I see some familiar faces and some people who I will learn to know, I'm sure, on this occasion better. I'm very pleased to be with you. I'm not turning the pages of my PowerPoint, but somebody is going to be doing it. So when I say turn the page, please do so. So could you put up the outline page to see what the talk's going to be about? Right. Here we are. That's the title. On to the next page. That's good. Thank you very much. So, as you can see, I've made an effort. That is to say, I'm not just giving you the paper that some of you would have had a chance to read on the subject about which I've been writing a lot recently, global social indicators, which is these attempts to rank throughout the world levels of human rights, of friendliness towards business, and which are the best universities, whatever it is, they're trying to rank it and make a sort of football league table out of it. And that's what we mean by global social indicators. So I could just have given you a talk about that, but I find myself invited to a very important initiative following up one of the most important new ideas within criminology, that is southernizing criminology. And it felt right to try and link what I've been working on to what you have been working on, and in fact know more about than I do. So you'll forgive me if some of the stuff will be a bit half-baked, because I'm trying, if you like, to reduce what I'm telling you, which is already in the paper, and add at either end and a bit in the middle how it might relate more directly to concerns of southernizing criminology. Although, of course, you will also be able to make your own links quite independent of my efforts. The risks, of course, of talking about something, and not for the first time, about which one knows not enough, is of being what Nigel Walker, my Cambridge supervisor of my doctorate, in his inaugural lecture, called being an intellectual helicopter. That is, coming into a field, kicking up a lot of dust, and then flying off again. I can assure you that having read something about southernizing criminology, I don't intend to do that. I intend to stay engaged.
Is everyone hearing that noise?
It's gone. No, somebody needs to.
It's the helicopter.
A helicopter. Very good. Thank you very much. That's very good. Zelia's explained that this is really an animated talk, and every time I say helicopter, there'll be a sound of a helicopter, and so on. Okay. So I'm afraid I'm going to mention it again. There's some danger of it coming back. So you know, how to avoid being an intellectual helicopter? By trying to engage. So I will, from now on, try and engage more with this fascinating subject, but also in a certain way, staying with the metaphor, it could be that these indicators could themselves be seen as a sort of intellectual helicopter. You know, they arrive in another part of the world, almost always the South, which is what concerns us, almost always the South, where it has makes a big difference, and says, you know, something is not being done as well as it could be or as well as it should be, using normally a standard based on the North, and then the caravan of people and experts who've gathered the data or who've transmitted the information move on somewhere else. So, you know, the first temptation is to think that there's nothing good can be said about global social indicators, but I would be trying to be a little bit more balanced than that, although a lot of what I have to say will certainly be critical. The next question is, okay, I want to talk about indicators. I want to relate it to southernizing criminology, but I don't want to make too big a claim here. So I think the two things overlap. Global indicators is an interesting subject in its own right. The growth of metrics, attempting to measure everything, to quantify, to produce results, to put responsibility on people, all that actually is going on a lot in the West, in the developed West. In fact, in some extent, more. In the more developed you are, the more this managerial mania, including universities, penetrates. So it's not really about the South, it's as much about the North, you could say, global social indicators, not more so. And a lot of Southernizing criminology is not necessarily about indicators, but about how to get criminology to face up to the fact that a lot of the most serious crimes historically and currently escape its paradigm and are to do with grasping how the state is part of the problem, not part of the solution, and the colonizing state created a particular idea of what crime was, which we have to get round and get out of. So that's not really what indicators are about. So I think the two topics overlap. They're not necessarily the same thing. I wouldn't pretend they are. But in some ways, I'm going to try and persuade you, I don't know how successfully, the concern with indicators, the critique of indicators seems to be rather similar, getting at many similar points and raising many similar concerns that a lot of writers, not all, but a lot of the writers who are interested in Southernizing criminology are also concerned about. And we'll come to that in a minute. So that, you know, asking questions about global indicators, what's good and bad, a bit like asking questions about the spread of human rights, good and bad, it raises topics which are central and not peripheral, I hope, to your concerns. What am I going to talk about today? As the outline suggests, I've done the first, why we should be interested in why Southernizing criminology should be interested in global social indicators. Tell you a bit about the issues of comparison and commensuration. And to get at what indicators do, their violence, you have to really understand better, as I've tried to, how comparison can be not just a sort of intellectual exercise, but a form of intellectual violence where you force things into being compared and comparable. And I think, again, that's very much what Southernizing criminology worries about, from what I've read. If we're talking about global social indicators, we have to know what we mean by indicators and types of indicators and the way they sort of rely on each other, collapse on each other. There's three types of indicators, and I'll tell you about that and about the debate over this third type of indicator called global social indicators. I mentioned before, the attempt to rank places worldwide. I'll mention what the paper was about, just so people don't feel they've wasted their time reading it. 2 case studies of indicators in the paper, which show how comparison and commensuration get mixed up, and then come back again to the question of implications, and do all that in 40 minutes. Next slide, please. Last point I haven't mentioned on this slide, because I've already got some way through this. No, please keep to the slide. Is that the puzzle of how global indicators and Southernizing criminology relate to each other is a puzzle that I think is worth trying to deal with as such, not just because it's necessary for me wanting to talk about one thing under the title of something else, because some of the authors, think of Jarrett Blaustein and Rosemary Barbaret, for example, when I look at collections of work on Southernizing criminology, they pop up. When I look at work on indicators, particularly indicators to do with gender or other matters of that sort, they pop up again. So they are, to some extent, and with reservations, as we'll see, promoting global indicators, even as they also belong to the movement of Southernizing criminology. So it really does interest me whether these projects, the projects of spreading indicators and the projects of Southernizing criminology can be combined or not, and what happens when you try to. Next slide. So some of the issues which are common to concern about globalizing indicators and Southernizing criminology is this question of what happens when, in the pursuit of standards, and let's never forget, a lot of the problems we're going to talk about with indicators is because they're not pursuing understanding and explanation. They're pursuing standardization, for better or worse. They're pursuing the spreading of standards. And when you do that, you decontextualize. You try and say, this is right, never mind what's going on there, never mind what's happening in the context. This is what should be happening there. So on the one hand, there's the decontextualization. On the other hand, there's the need, whether it be for intellectual reasons or for political reasons, for specification, to stay close to what is happening in a place and understand its logic, not to try and cancel it in the name of some standard. There's the question of governing and empowering. Indicators, as we'll see later, govern. They sort of, often in a pretended form of deep political, technological, just giving you information, say this is what has to happen, and this place is the standard which others should follow. And again, on the other hand, on the other side, there's the attempt to resist this, to empower people to say no. As in Standardizing Criminology, no, we don't want that. That's not the right standard for us. There's the issue of universalizing and relativizing. You know, standards means universal, relativizing means no. Or one can get easily caught up in problems there because you can't universalize the principle of relativism. On the other hand, saying, well, that doesn't apply to us isn't necessarily criticism of a standard. It's to say, to give a reason why the standard doesn't apply. The standard could be right at a different time or in a different way. But trying to fix this question of universal and relative seems to me to be an issue that definitely does come up in Standardizing Criminology and is central to the spreading of indicators. And linked to that, epistemicide, the way in which criminology and the global indicators know the answer. And they know the answer on the basis of a certain knowledge and a certain way of getting knowledge, which can only be resisted if you say, no, the best that you're trying to do here is to promote debate, to put things into question, not actually to know the answer. But as I say, as I've written in the past about some people who want to have indicators and debate, they're trying to have their cake and eat it. It's difficult to have standards and to say the reason for standards is to promote debate. Because think about if law did that, if you could argue about murder, what's going to happen to the law of murder? So it's not the simplest thing to combine those. That's why I'm putting them as if they're on a continuum. And there's the question of what's all this got to do with colonialism, neo-colonialism, what Southernizing Criminology is very much concerned with. Should we view the spread of indicators or of certain indicators or the method of ruling through indicators as a form of new colonialism, and to which the only answer is to resist it, to reveal it, as Southernizing Criminology tells us. But then, what do? You're trying to spread human rights to Afghanistan, and somebody comes along and says, this is new colonialism, epistemicide, all the bad things on the first side of the table here. And you look in your BBC and the secondary school girls who have been stopped going to school are saying, help us. And we say, Southernizing Criminology. So there is something to be understood here. These are genuine polarities, but what the practical implications of them we'll come back to at the end of the discussion of my talk anyway, with no definite answers, but possibly a slightly clearer idea about what the challenge is. Next slide, please. Why do I call comparison a social practice? Because as somebody who moved country and therefore was fascinated by the differences of way things are done even within Great Britain compared to Italy, never mind further afield, about which I don't write, and people say, people that know can only write about Europe. The reason is because I don't think you should write about places you don't know. So my homage to Southernizing Criminology is precisely not to do Southernizing Criminology as a descriptive exercise, because I haven't lived in the places concerned, and I think you shouldn't write about places without knowing them. But that's what you do if you're an academic doing comparison. But if you're a practitioner, somebody in the real world, you might have lots of good reasons to compare, even if you haven't been to the places, even if you're not being academic about it, because you're trying to learn, you're trying to borrow, you're trying to change other places and so on. So there's lots of comparison that goes on, not academically. And what I mean by second order comparisons is that we academics then could come in, and instead of trying to compare the places or the units or the times or the levels, whatever we're comparing, we could be interested in understanding how other people in practice compare, not academics, but people whose job it is, who requires them to do so and to often justify what they're doing by saying they're trying to be more like A or less like B. And I think that does have relevance to Southernizing criminology, because, as we know, there's a sort of often a sort of envy of the advanced West, which means that you have to take on what they do. And to understand how that, how that works, how hegemony is hegemony precisely because it's shared, it's not just imposed, as Gramsci explained, would be relevant to comparison as a second order, which means we're looking at how people go about comparing, even when they get it wrong. A bit like the social studies of science, we're less interested in whether they get things right. We bracket that question. We just want to know, how is it the comparison goes on as a practical exercise? Now, as soon as one's interested in doing that, comparisons of practical exercise, one comes up against this issue, which has fascinated me the last year or two, the difference between comparing and commensurating. Comparing and commensurating. And I put it like this, not everybody agrees with me. When you're comparing, particularly if you're an academic, not a practitioner, you're comparing because you want to know all about the similarities and all about the differences. And, they're both interesting. And if you're any good at comparing, you have to have a reason why they're both interesting. The reason is, if it's similar when you might have expected to be different on some theoretical basis, tell us about it. Or if it's different when you might have expected to be similar, tell us about it. You have to have a good reason for a finding to be interesting, but it could be interesting, a show of similarity or a show of difference. You're equally interested in both those things. Commensuration is not like that. So comparison is knowing as much as possible about the matters being compared, or this contextualization that we've talked about already, to highlight both similarities and differences. Next slide. Next slide. Commensuration is somewhere, should have been there, but it isn't. I'll tell you what it would have said, unless it's going to come up in a minute. Commensuration, well, all right, I won't say what commensuration is. Let's go back to the previous slide. So comparing, leave out commensuration, comparing is all about trying to get to the issue of what's similar and what's different. And the very odd, I'll tell you in a minute why it's very odd to me, the very odd way of capturing this obsession of comparativists with getting it right, the degree of similarity, the degree of difference, is captured in this idea of you can't compare apples and pears, or you can't compare apples and oranges. And these famous books in comparative law, comparative constitutional law, hit you with the pictures of apples and oranges. We all know what that's about. To which the reaction might well be, often it's been my reaction, why, of all things to compare, why on earth not compare apples and oranges? I mean, it's the most sensible comparison I can think of. They're both fruit, but they're different in some ways. Don't try and eat the peel of an orange, it's not the same as an apple. Why not? Of all things, you think that, apples and elephants, no, right, but apples and oranges. So it's very odd. But what it shows, this odd obsession, and I've also in the paper you've been given to read, given lots of parallels in other languages, which is important. It's not just an obsession in the English language with how difficult it is to know whether you're comparing something that is right to compare, whether it was worth comparing. This obsession is because if you compare something which is too alike, then not much is going to be learned. If you compare things which are too different, then not much point. You wouldn't compare an apple to an elephant normally, though in theory, of course, you could. In theory, anything is comparable with anything, but in useful theory, it would require you to have a reason to compare things. So not apples and oranges, because apparently they're not sufficiently similar, although in my view, it'd be hard to see, anything more suitable for comparison. Some other languages are much more straightforward. You can't compare grandmothers and long johns. Long johns are a type of underwear. I don't know who's ever been tempted to compare grandmothers and long johns, and I wonder whether they're making exactly the same point, because trying to parse it, and I really don't know the meaning of this proverb. Proverbs are often very interesting, or similes, because they They've lasted a long time and nobody's asked themselves why, you know. But I assume that the reason to say you can't compare apples and oranges is to warn you, to warn us that things that look as if they're similar might not be at the end of the day. So you can't compare apples and oranges. It means don't assume they're exactly the same. So be careful when you do comparisons not to miss out on difference. That's what the message is. But if that's the message, not comparing grandmothers and long johns doesn't seem to be the same message, because very few people are likely to think they are the same thing. And yet that is the equivalent in another language, which just shows how baffling it is when you move between languages. But the point that I'm trying to make, I hope successfully, is that comparing is all about trying to understand whether you are comparing the same things, whether things are sufficiently alike, what is similar, and what is different. That's what comparing is about. Now, commensuration, a term which began at the same time as comparing in the 16th century and had very similar meanings at one point, commensuration means something different by now, if we move to the next slide. Successful commensuration is to deliberately compare the incomparable. The relevance of this as Southernizing criminology we'll see, because, you know, the reaction of Southernizing criminologists, you're imposing on me a structure comparison which isn't applicable. It doesn't understand. It's just making it similar when it's not really similar, is exactly what commensuration intends to do consciously. It seeks to apply a similar standard, note standard, and to make alike an equivalent. If you're making an indicator on corruption and you put Sweden at the top, as always, and you put Somalia at the bottom, of course they're not comparable. Of course they're not alike. Of course they're not apples and oranges. You'd be lucky. You'd pray for apples and oranges. Sweden and Somalia have nothing to do with each other in terms of corruption. And the more reasons you can give why it's hard to have Swedish types of standards of corruption applying in Somalia, because they're totally different places and one's in the middle of a civil war and whatever, the more reasons you give, the more you make persuasive your indicator. You don't undermine the comparison. You supply many more reasons why, yes, it's very plausible to say on that particular standard that we're using for corruption, on that, begging the question what corruption is, on that definition of corruption, which is be like Sweden, Somalia does very badly. So the fact that they're not comparable doesn't weaken, should it? I don't know. But it doesn't seem to weaken the success of this exercise of comparison, which here takes the form of commensuration. It's always a form of comparison, but a different form of comparison, a form of comparison which is about trying to make alike, it's a social practice, comparison social practice, making something, make it alike, spatchcock it in there, like forcing the football team that plays in your local park to be in the same football league as Manchester United. And at least they're both playing football, but often with these league tables, not even sure that the places are attempting to do the same thing. Nonetheless, they should be. The fact that we claim they should be, and we put them in the same place with others that are doing so, shows them up, shames them, and is designed to make them change. And this is what global social indicators do. Comparison here is judgmental. It's not fair. What matters is its usefulness. Usefulness to who? Well, to people who want to know where to invest their money, to people who want to change the way Somalia is governed, whatever. Maybe even to some people in Somalia. It's another question. We don't know who it's really useful for. And it's amazing, it's quite amazing, that we appear to think that these things can be useful despite, maybe even because, we don't want to know what's really going on in context. We decontextualize. I'm going to come back again and again to this. The decontextualizing, it's for an academic who spends their time trying to, one way or the other, whatever the methodology we find to our taste, we're trying to understand places in depth, to be told, no, it's not about that here. It's not really about understanding differences in context. It's about finding a common standard, applying it, and letting the thing falls where it falls. And it falls out that Sweden is great and Somalia is not. On this particular standard. Take some other standard, cooking, whatever, it might work out differently, right? Bad luck to Sweden. But on this, that's what happens. Next slide. So I've been talking about indicators, and this is not so much in the literature, although it should be. I think we need to understand that indicators are a combination of three different types of, the global social indicators are a combination of three different ways in which we use indicators and what we can mean by indicators. So an indicator basically is a simplification, really. If you want to, as an academic, understand whether democracy and corruption vary in some sort of correlation way, then you need to define what you mean by corruption, define what you mean by democracy, and you'll tend to take an indicator of both things, you know, presence of parliaments or number of cases of corruption taken to court. You look for an indicator. And so an explanatory indicator is simply a simplifying, deliberately simplifying variable that will stand in for what you want to study as best you can. You can find some way of simplifying what it is, the concept or the issue that you want to study, and look for correlations if you're doing that sort of social scientific work. Can there also be qualitative indicators? Probably yes, but most of the time, particularly for global social indicators, we're talking about quantitative type of research. Second type of indicator is a policy indicator, and a policy indicator, you know, you want to reduce road traffic accidents. You build a new motorway. You then look if the accidents have gone down. So your indicator has been road accidents. You've done an intervention, and you've seen whether or not you've met it. Of course, again, here, your definition of what you're trying to achieve by this policy could be imposed from above, or it could even be asking the people concerned, you know, people who use the roads or the people who live nearby, whatever. And the target that you set doesn't have to be imposed from above. It could be locally based, but policy and indicators is trying to see whether you've achieved what you're trying to do. Global social indicators, which one can also call ranking indicators, or as in the title of this paper here, standardizing indicators, are different again, it seems to me, because they don't reflect an ongoing intervention. Think about it. Nobody's intervening in Somalia to deal with corruption before you have a global social indicator about it. There might be, but there also might not be. That's not the point. The global social indicator, a bit like when you're measuring hotels or restaurants, or the millions of ways in which we now take indicators for granted, you know, they are telling us what whoever is being relied on as the source of data, the experts, the businessmen, the academics, whoever supplies us data about the place says is true about that place in relation to a certain standard. Then we're not concerned with a particular intervention and the indicator which tells us whether or not we've succeeded, sort of benchmark, the yardstick in that particular indicator, that particular intervention. But as you can tell, they're all variations on a theme, you know, the simplification, the idea that it's a target, is all, it seems to me, built on in the idea of a global social indicator. It's all there, but for other purposes, you might want to distinguish these rather different tasks: explaining, policy achievement, and ranking and standardizing, that is, making alike. Next. Again, time is short, so is life, so I can't give you a full summary of the debate about global social indicators. Some of you will know a lot about it anyway, but there are lots of great books about it, Ranking the World, in French as well, and Quiet Power of Indicators, Worlds of Indicators, lots and lots of books, lots and lots of case studies of the different indicators that are out there, put out by the different organizations, Freedom House, if you want your rule of law, the World Bank, if you want to know a place to go for good business, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of this going on. One of the leading commentators was my friend who sadly died last year, Sally Mary, who wrote very important points about the matter. And what she specifically nailed down, as you can see in the heading of this slide, was what she called the truth effects and the governance effects of global social indicators, of this, the third of the three indicators that I just mentioned. More than explanatory indicators, more even than policy indicators, these type of indicators achieve truth effects, you know, to use the Foucauldian language, and governance effects. Meaning that when you create an indicator, of something, you're not just measuring the conformity in the world of all these different places in the north and in the south, but not only, to the indicator, you're also creating the very category that might not have existed before you went out to measure it. We're all familiar with intelligence as measured by intelligence tests. And some of those like me who do badly on intelligence tests are never willing to accept that that's the only way of defining intelligence. But it's become useful as a way of defining what intelligence is, even though it only is actually defining what its particular test of intelligence is, not something that exists independently of IQ. That, by the way, is not an example of a global social indicator, but it's an example of truth effect. Here, truth effect would be you create a category of fragile states or failing states, and you then say, well, back to Somalia, you're one of those. But without that category, without that attempt to measure places, it might be that that whole concept would not really have existed. So you bring it into existence. Of course, it could be said that all concepts do that, without a concept, where is the reality? But that's worth further discussion. But certainly for those concerned about indicators, this truth effects matters. One example why that matters, we don't have an indicator of states which are too strong. I can certainly think of some. We only have indicators of states which are too weak. And so again, those interested in standardizing criminology, might ask themselves, what would happen if, and how could we imagine having an indicator of the harms caused, not by fragile states, but by states which are too strong? Bring that into existence. And then that would make you think, well, who would want to spend the money? And now you get follow the money to produce all the infrastructure and apparatus that would allow you to create, starting with the south, this time looking at the north, categories of two strong states. And you begin to see that truth effects do matter. As do, of course, governance effects, by which she meant that all this, when you look at all the wonderful graphs and the pictures and the pie charts and the figures and the rest of it and the maps, you tend to get carried away with the technological side of indicators. Social science seems to be really busy. And you forget that actually this is politics by another name, given that politics is deciding who gets what, and indicators, once they get accepted in their definition of what corruption is, or what the rule of law is, or whether you're doing enough to join the European Union or not, and all the ways indicators are used, are extraordinarily potent as political weapons and clearly are taking political stances. Next slide. So far, and much of it, I hope what I've said is not new to you, but a little bit maybe. So far, I've put on the fire, as we say in Italian, the issue of comparison and commensuration and the different forms of indicators out there, and in particular, the role of global indicators in creating truth and governing. Now let's try and put those two things together. As I've already said to you, I think the global social indicators are these machines for creating commensuration. They are attempting to make alike by taking for granted that we agree with the standard and with the theory behind the standard, which is enshrined in the particular indicator in question, which then has the football league placing places or units, because there can be businesses sometimes, not just countries, in a ranking order. So what happens to comparison in that process? What is being done to the places that are being compared in terms of the standard by this form of commensuration? What's happening is what you would expect to happen. You're decontextualizing. You're saying, I'm going to apply the same standard to Sweden and Somalia. The same standard, despite the fact that they are very different places. Now, Mary calls this a paradox, because in order to do that, the indicators cannot be rooted in local context. So breaking what I think is sort of the first commandment of standardizing criminology, you don't try and root your indicator in the local context. And yet to reflect the local situation, to get it right, to have that description of a place in relation to another, about corruption, about rule of law, about anything, to get it right, to be fair in any sense to what the conditions are in that place, you would need to know more about the local situation, would you not? So how can you at the same time not be rooted in the local context to apply not a universal standard, at least a transnational standard, and at the same time also tell us about places in relation to others in a way that does justice, is fair, is even accurate about what's going on in the given place. Next slide. So, let's see if I've missed anything really important. So, the paper wasn't written for the purpose of this talk, as you know. It contains 2 case studies which show how comparison and commensuration get in each other's way. So that's sort of relevant to what we've been saying, even though they doesn't explicitly talk about standardizing criminology. And it tries to make us see that the comparison that's going on, the comparison of places which leads you to rank them, and what you're relying on in terms of data, and then what you, as an outcome, say is the comparison that you've produced through your commensuration, that this is not in the service of academic comparison looking for similarities and differences, but in the service of other more practical purposes. What I've been talking about, comparisons as social practice. You know, you can do comparisons for all sorts of reasons. And getting it right, whatever that means, is somehow subservient to the particular purpose you have in mind. So, if you're interested in in an example of a global indicator which is more concerned with target setting, more linked to what we talked about as policy indicator, then you have the UN development indicators, which are replacing the previous Millennium Goals, which was also sort of indicator. And there's an example of comparison and commensuration, because the goals being pursued in our name by the United Nations are applied willy-nilly to all the different countries of the world, as if they are right, as if they are correct standards that those places should be pursuing, whether or not they are. And we then will look at, over time, what progress the world, and the UN in particular, has made in improving the quality in terms of those standards, many of which standards which those who advocate standardizing criminology would surely share, standards in terms of treatment of women, racial minorities, of the environment, and the rest of it. But these goals are being enshrined in an indicator, setting a target, and the whole apparatus we've been talking about so far of global social indicators is then mobilized to try and achieve this. Question, at what cost? We'll come back to that. And going even further, indicators can be not just part of the purpose of setting targets, of trying to shame places, like with human trafficking indicators, into changing their behavior, or in getting some countries with the US human trafficking indicator that it's invented, using it to give favored status or to take away favored status in different countries, or allowing the European Union to say you've got to do something about how you treat gypsies before you let you into the European Union. So it's all some of it very useful stuff, you might think. It's not just about target setting and seeing where people have met targets and shaming places, but it is already, as you see it there, it's attempting to change those places to make them behave better, because the obvious result of you being assessed in terms of a particular standard and wanting often to have access to what's only given to those who meet the standard is that you change your behavior, you country, you business that have to pretend to be corporate responsible or whatever. And COVID indicators, where we've all been, many of us have been looking at newspapers and television and so on, throwing graphs and figures of what's been happening the whole time in different places, show that, again here too, indicators can become a form of social control. So they're not just as with the UN development indicators, which do concern criminal justice issues. They're not just measures of what's happening to social control in different places, to criminal justice, and to how far it meets standards in different places. Indicators themselves, in themselves and of themselves, are a form of social control. But they are designed and succeed in changing behavior, often, albeit in unpredictable ways, but they are meant to. When we see these graphs, when countries see how they're doing in COVID compared to other countries, they are supposed to change their behavior. Well, all of this you'll say, well, of course, it's obvious and nothing interesting. Well, it is interesting if you remember what I've tried to establish so far. If the nail stays stuck to the wall, doesn't fall out. You are commensurating the COVID indicators. You are comparing places which are totally different in what they can do about COVID in terms of whether workers have to go out under conditions or not. That's interesting. And you are using as a standard how many people are getting ill, how many people are dying, how many people have had vaccinations, as if these criteria are universalizable across very different places. And you don't care whether you're being fair or not. You don't say, do you? It's not fair to talk about what's happening in one country or another without taking into account all sorts of other things. You simply say, for the purposes, for example, of knowing whether it's safe to travel to those places, or for the purpose of knowing whether they must be doing something right if they've got low numbers, we want to compare. So comparison, where you're concerned with the standard, and here the standard is reduced number of deaths and illnesses, is very uninterested in comparing like with like, couldn't care less about apples and oranges. Next slide. So that's just the Sustainable Development Indicators of the United Nations have 17 different goals for which they use indicators to show whether they're achieving them or not. And if you read recent work by Blaustein on it, if you go to the next slide, he comes to the conclusion, here's a vote for indicators. They provide the best available framework for balancing local development and security needs with global priorities of criminological concern. I mean, this is not out of context, this quote, but you would need to read his whole article, published recently, to see the nuances. He's also got criticisms. He says you need a critical approach to indicators, but all said and done, he comes down on the side, as you can see in this quote, of thinking that they, if you're a Southernizing criminologist, you ought to embrace them. So the matter is worthy of further study, it seems to me, if, as I mentioned at the outset, you find people on both sides, both writing in Southernizing criminology books, trying to radicalize criminology in this way, but also signing on to global social indicators under certain circumstances for certain purposes. Next slide. Next slide. And Rosemary Barberet, in a handbook of comparative criminal justice that I'm just finishing editing now in her, and we do have a chapter on Southernizing criminology as well. Rosemary Barberet, writing about gender and crime, she even helpfully, I think, not knowing that I would have wanted to write this text, but it's a perfect text for my purposes, she's actually saying too much context, dangerous. Decontextualization, bring it on. She's accepting this is what indicators do. They do not learn about differences and similarities. The ideal comparativist. No. And why is she worried about it? Because she sees taking context too seriously as somehow biasing you into accepting that what is right. That she's worried about the relativism end of the universal relativist continuum. And she says, and I quote, precisely because counting, the quantitative approach, very far from the anthropologist grasping why things happen, from the inside, ethnography, talking to people. No, the counting decontextualizes well of visitors. It's more convincing. It holds to account. In other words, the question of what you're doing comparisons for. Comparisons are social practice, as I keep saying. Here, as a social practice trying to produce change, to be legitimate, you have to be quantitative to be legitimate. Does it matter that you decontextualize, which means you don't really understand the place you're talking about? No, bring it on. Bring it on. She wants it. Next slide. I'll be brief here because this is not as germane as the other things we've talked about. COVID indicators have many different roles, so they show how comparison can be done for many different purposes. Remember also that global social indicators, unlike other normative vehicles, are very much a matter of how people choose to use them, and you can't really control how they're used, you know. So when you say which place is more or less corrupt, it's not just that the government is sort of stamping, you know, in terms of the governance role, this place is good, this place is bad. Once you put the indicator out there, people act on it, travelers, businessmen, whatever. And very hard to imagine how you would regulate that behavior, because people can choose to use information in the way they want. Indicators I've been urging are far more than information, but they're also not less than information. And therefore, as information, even if it's global gossip, it will have all sorts of uses that you cannot stop, you cannot regulate successfully, you know? To the extent that the truth of indicators, going back to truth effects, becomes actually irrelevant. If you're a parent and you want your kid to go to a good university and you believe in these stupid measures of which are the best universities, it doesn't really matter to you how on earth the people thought these things up, which is normally they thought them up to make sure that Harvard comes top, otherwise nobody will believe in them. So they have to invent the standard to meet what everybody thinks already, otherwise they'll never sell. But they get their indicator up there. For example, you can imagine much better indicators of universities in terms of, you know, the number of people from poorer backgrounds they bring in, or all sorts of criteria. But no, the criteria used are criteria which are very much establishment ones. But if you're a parent wanting the best for your child, and you define the best for your child as being the best chance to get on in the world as it is, you're not really interested in whether or not Harvard is the best university. It's become a currency. You know that by sending the child to Harvard, other people will take it seriously. And like the pound note paper, nobody asks what stands behind it, because you can pass it from hand to hand. You can pass the degree from Harvard from hand to hand. The truth value of it becomes irrelevant. Now, you may say that surely doesn't apply to COVID indicators. Who we're talking about life and death? Who knows? Because one of the strange things is that, you know, the definition of death by COVID is extremely different from one place to another, you know. And there were many, many features of these figures and graphs comparing places over time and between countries, which, you know, the truth, the actual knowledge behind it, very questionable. But it didn't matter, because the point that we're doing all the time was trying to get people to change their behavior, trying to worry people into change. Some might say this is a form of governing through worries as well, but I'm not quite on that conspiracy level. But I certainly think that the truth content of many of these communications about COVID was less important than saying, watch out, put your masks on, do what we tell you, and so on. And where you could worry people by saying we're doing worse than another place, and usually where most countries like to say they're doing better, they were quite happy to do that, because this would reinforce the message, you better watch out and do what you're told. Next slide. What's that doing? Well, even if I'm right that COVID indicators and global indicators in general are about commensuration, not about comparison, about decontextualizing, about standardizing, not about fair comparison, the truth is that you never can entirely get rid of the question of fairness. It bothers people. They do ask themselves, wait a minute, why are we comparing this with that, you know? And some of the figures that were thrown at us sort of try and say, well, yes, of course. And I can't talk about the numbers of people dying in these countries without also thinking about how many old people there are in the countries, Or you know, if you're living in Norway, you never meet anybody, so you're not going to catch it, are you? But if you live in Tokyo, you are. So there's an attempt to, and if you think about it, it's totally rational to get back into context, because if you don't bring the context in, what you're saying is pretty meaningless. How can you compare, if you're talking about, you know, success in dealing with COVID or dangers or whatever, Norway with Japan, without knowing that they're very different places? And same with Somalia and Sweden. So you bring in some elements here, the size of the country, the level of old people, but only some. And there are many hundreds of others which are equally relevant if you really want to contextualize, which are not brought in. It's sort of half-hearted attempt to contextualize. Why? Because the thrust of commensuration is always away from contextualization. That's what I wanted to show you. Next slide. The reason why you don't compare like with like, why you don't worry about the apples and oranges, is because the users of indicators are normally less interested in the fairness of the comparison than they are with what the implications of the alleged differences between places are for them. So if you're a consumer of communication like this, you want to know where it's safe to go. You're not really concerned with why it is or isn't safe for a country that hasn't got money to spend on this, that, and the other, or where you can't get food without going to the local market or whatever. The problem is, as I say, that a lot of this is not solid, and the Lancet and the World Health Organization pleaded even for the definition of COVID to be made the same across countries, and that was never done throughout this. And the standardization is precisely what a global indicator tries to do, for better or worse. It tries to standardize the meaning of something. Then, of course, the question of whether that was a standard meaning which is equally applicable, helpful, and relevant for the places being compared, that question becomes disappeared, because everybody assumes, oh, COVID death means that. But since this all happened in such a hurry, the question of how you define COVID, dying with COVID, dying from COVID, and so on, all these issues actually remained open and unresolved till this time. Also due to the question of legitimation, the level of legitimation of the organizations pushing an indicator, which is crucial and goes to the governing role of them. The World Health Organization, for particular historical mistakes it had made leading up to, even before the problem of China and so on, in previous episodes of epidemics, meant that it had lost lots of its legitimacy, and therefore its ability to standardize had gone. Next slide. We're now at the end. So thinking about some of the things that I've mentioned, we go back to the starting problems of, you know, these polarities of decontextualizing versus specifying, governing, empowering, universalizing, and so on. And let's have some illustrations. Next slide. So you might say, well, it depends on which indicator. You know, if we are Southernizing criminologists, we might embrace some indicators, human rights, and not be interested in others like World Bank's Better Business, which penalize places which don't have or didn't have a neoliberal approach to more market, less state. We can be choosy. It's not a question of saying indicators good, indicators bad. Let's be choosy.
You done? I was just listening to a presentation on stuff. It's okay.
Oh, nice. I'm done.
Oh, okay.
Bye-bye. And not all indicators favor the North compared to the South, which is what we've been sort of assuming, and many people writing about it assuming. Let's see that in the next slide or two. Next slide. So this is the typical example of indicators which the Southernizing criminologist would get exercised about. This is a map from Transparency International, who, let's not forget, was set up by somebody who left the World Bank. And it shows in red the corrupt places. Surprise, surprise. And in yellow, the nice places, which are an unexpected mixture of places like Scandinavia and places like the US and Australia, which for other purposes, including prison rates, are in different places altogether on the indicators. But there we are. And that reinforces your idea of, yeah, watch out for these global indicators, Blaustin and Barbara, you know, be careful what you're buying into here. They're north versus south. You be careful. You're not taking enough, angels fear to tread. So this is what you'd expect. All that I could say against that is you will find many people in these red areas who will say, please don't be patronizing and say, well, we do what we do and you do what you do and your corruption standards aren't relevant for us. Please help us. And people within such countries often use a global indicator as a method of hitting what they consider to be corrupt elites in their own country. So it isn't quite as simple as this is north versus south, although it certainly looks like it. Next slide. Opposite. Here is a slide that makes you look as if an indicator can naturally put a finger in the eye of the global north, because this is rule of law indicator. And you'd think, well, we'll hear the same thing again as in the previous indicator, the south is bad and the north is good. But oh no, this is about improvements in the rule of law. And the yellow part is things getting worse, and the other more blue and grey colours are things getting better. And if you look carefully, yeah, I mean, Scandinavia is still doing all right, but America, Britain are amongst those doing badly, and many places in Africa, the majority of Africa is doing better than before. So there we are, a rule of law indicator telling you the south is good and the north is bad, even though, as all indicators, it's certainly going to be made in the north, paid for in the north, and applied mainly in the south. But here too, caution, just as previously what looked bad might be good, here what looks good might be bad. These changes towards our standard rule of law, this growth of the criminal justice state on the Western model, do we really want that to be spreading in the South? So, things are not, all that glitters isn't gold. On the one hand, an indicator doesn't have to necessarily have all its good places in the global north. Here's the evidence. On the other hand, it's clear that the standard it's using, for better or worse, is likely to be a standard very much linked to what is appropriate, what has come out of the global north, given that it's a standard applying to everywhere, hardly likely to be based on what an indigenous or a pre-colonial or other type of definition of what ideal criminal justice is. Next slide. There's much more to be said, and we haven't got time to say it. An indicator has a life of its own. It can be resisted. The World Bank indicator, which sort of said, South Africa, not a good place to do business. Why? Because it is hard to get rid of employees. And we talk about difficulty getting rid of employees as meaning zero sum, bad for business. Easy to get rid of employees, good for business. They fought back. They fought back. With academics like Paul Collier being actively involved in fighting back, and they won, and the World Bank lost. Also because the hegemony about neoliberal ideas of big market began to crumble anyway. They fought back saying, you're not allowed to do this. We in South Africa, given our situation here, have to have, for those lucky enough to have work, some protections, and don't tell us that having protections for work is something which is against the interests of business. It doesn't have to be. And the World Bank had to take that out of its definition of what's good for business. Other way around, you can have an indicator of whether people are fighting human traffic. And if you read this important article by a leading criminologist and somebody from the place concerned, John Hagan and Marina Zalesnotsia, you find that people can be, dictators can be doing a great job of fighting human trafficking and get lots of marks, but actually the fighting human trafficking turns out to be a way of trying to cover up their breaches of human rights in other fields and of stopping people traveling so they don't get to learn about how things are better in places outside Belarus under the name of stopping human trafficking. So an indicator and success on an indicator is something which, as always, we who study comparisons of social practice, how do people decide in their comparisons what is good and bad? We have to get behind that and understand what is really happening. Next, last slide. Yes, let's skip that because we haven't got time to talk about quantitative and qualitative, although it's interesting, something we can come back to. Conclusions. Depends on who makes the indicator, who gathers what data, where, how, when, for whom. Local power holders or experts shouldn't always be allowed to win. If you have a sort of wider indicator, it takes away some of their power. And do Southernizing criminologists always assume that the local power holders, the local sources of knowledge should always be listened to? Shouldn't they have their legitimacy sometimes put into question? What's the role of social movements when it comes to global indicators? And last but not least, Blaustein and Barbara, who are not here to speak for themselves, would probably say that what they like about the UN indicators is that they've left the idea that you measure the world, that the standards you use are those of gross national product, and instead are moving towards what Sen and Nussbaum talked about in terms of human capacities, you know? So maybe the Southernizing criminologist is happy with indicators if they get the criterion right of what the standards should be. The standards should be education, health, and so on. This is what matters for each place in the world, not how rich they are, how much business is going on. Here too, yes and no. It's a very important point, of course, but what's sometimes missed, I think, and I hope I've said enough to show it, is that the problem with global indicators for the Southernizing criminologists might be not just the substance of what it's trying to achieve, what the goal of a particular indicator is, health, education, as compared to business conditions, or even rule of law in a sort of northern conception of law or southern conception of law. The problem might be that the very instrument itself, in its way of seeking targets and of social control, is itself a neoliberal instrument. It is very much a way of putting responsibility onto the units being compared, the countries, the corporations, in the case of COVID, the individuals. It shifts responsibility. At a distance, it says, look, you're doing badly, do something about it. So that the neoliberalism, this concern we have about all that neoliberalism represents in terms of, for Southernizing criminology, the individual versus the collective, state versus the market, all these things are actually present in an instrument which has a particular time and place, you know, and is part of, as I said at the beginning, something which is happening mainly in the north, the extension of metrics, of quantification, of governing by numbers, leading, but this would be another talk, to artificial intelligence as a method of ruling, which will, I think, replace indicators. It's part of a trajectory and a putting responsibility onto people, which is itself problematic, independent of whatever goals you are trying to achieve through it. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor David Nelken, for this fantastic presentation. It was great.